All right, hello and welcome to the video. In this video, my name is Wade Daniel Smith, and this video is about the ontological argument and the fact that it proves there is only one true God. And when I explained this to some people, because I got sick and tired of watching fictional versus debates where people were falsely claiming omnipotent beings could exist in fiction. And so I explained this to them, and one of them denied the ontological argument and claimed that he could undermine the ontological argument by simply just because he could concoct the false phrase super God by putting the word before God and then insert that into the ontological argument in place of the original word God. He then tried to claim that his false super God could somehow be greater than the real God that the ontological argument is describing. And I explained to him that he missed the point of all three of the first three premises of the ontological argument, because it already addresses that. All right? I was like, you made a fictional God, and he already states that a being that exists in reality is greater than one that exists only in the mind. All right? So let me explain what the ontological argument is. In Anselm's original version of the ontological argument that he published, I think there are actually 6 lines to the argument, but I think I figured out how to simplify it to just 4 lines. I think I figured out that 2 of his lines aren't even necessary a long time ago. So here's my new version of the ontological argument. I still use it. I think the exact same line that he uses for line 1. So it goes, God, as we understand him, is a being than which no greater being can be conceived. So so the God that we are talking about, we're defining what we even mean by the word God here in line 1. So we're saying that God, you can't even, we're making the claim that the God we're trying to describe to you, you can't even make up a lie that somehow represents something greater than the real God. And we're about to tell you why that is so in line 2. All right. So in line 2, it states that a being which exists in reality is greater than a fictional being, a being that exists only in the mind. So obviously, something that is real is greater in at least one property, hopefully it is, than anything you could imagine fictionally, because the fiction is at best a lie if it claims to be greater than something real. So automatically, the second point, no sane person, even an atheist, could argue against the second point, because that's what it means to be fiction, is that it is not true. So you cannot have an imaginary or fictional or something in your mind that is not real somehow be greater than something that is real, no matter how many false claims you make about it. And hopefully no sane person, not even an atheist, would disagree with point 2 for some reason. So then point 3 says, therefore we cannot be imagining God that we referred to in line 1, because even if you don't know the actual attributes of the God we're trying to define in line 1 and don't know exactly what name to name him by, because he never claims to know that in the argument, at least in the argument itself, he doesn't claim to know that yet. Nor does he make any religious or doctrinal statements about this God, nor does he even try to define what human goodness and evil are. He's just trying to define what God means, what we mean by the word God, as a device to explain to an atheist that there actually is an almighty being. That you can just logically reason it out. But atheists refuse to admit that. They claim they want to see God. And then they say that if God did reveal himself to them, they would tell him to go fuck himself, because I've had them do that to me all the time. But they lie when they say they want to see God, because they're liars. They hate God even if he does exist, quote unquote. And I've even had them say that they would rather go to hell than to obey God and go to heaven as atheists. That even if God appeared to them, they would not worship him and would rather go to hell than worship God and go to heaven. I've had them say that all the time. So anyway, the fourth point of the ontological argument resolves that because we cannot be imagining God, the fourth point then says, therefore, God exists. The same God that we're claiming exists in verse 1, in argument 1, cannot be imaginary Because we already said we're not talking about something imaginary in line 2. That something real is automatically greater than anything imaginary in line 2. So then we said we can't be imagining the God we're talking about. Therefore, an actual almighty God must exist. And that doesn't even require knowledge of science or physics. That is pure logic. All right? And then, the cosmological argument actually proves that scientifically through logic. We know that the universe is expanding and that it came from a past finite condition, regardless of how old it really is. We know that from the cosmic red shift. And so we know the universe is past finite. So about half the science community still denies that, even though it's a well-known fact. And that is the whole point that proved general relativity correct. And proved Einstein's original cosmological constant wrong. And he had to admit that he was wrong. Because the only reason he put it in there was because he was an atheist at the time. And so he admitted that the cosmological constant was the biggest mistake of his career and rewrote general relativity to agree with Hubble's discovery that the universe was not static and self-eternal, but was in fact expanding and was in fact past finite. Because Einstein originally believed that the universe itself was self-eternal, which was totally wrong and always known to be wrong. He should have known from the law of entropy alone that the universe could not be self-eternal. Because the law of entropy forbids the universe to be self-eternal, even if you didn't know about the red shift. Because the only way it could be eternal is if it's being remade all the time by God in the first place. Because the law of entropy forbids something on its own to be self-eternal other than God. So we know that the universe is past finite. And we know from Rene Descartes and from common sense, if you admitted there was common sense, we know from Rene Descartes' formal proof that from nothing comes nothing. And in fact, I can show you in set theory that you cannot possibly get anything from a condition of true nothingness. All right? So an empty set does not even have a name. Honestly, they actually incorrectly name empty sets in math and physics to help you keep you from getting confused. But nothing is no thing. It has no physical properties because it is non-existence. It's not even a noun in the dictionary. All right. So the claim by Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins that the universe came from absolutely nothing is a complete lie that even they already know is a lie. They're just saying that because they're blaspheming God. And they know there's a God and they refuse to admit that. And they're just intentionally blaspheming God because they hate God. The reason Stephen Hawking hated God is because he had ALS. And so he just figured screw God. And he even said so in his books that in spite of the fact that he didn't believe in God, he asked the question then because he knew the universe was not self-eternal, and he also knew the universe did not come from absolutely nothing. He asked the question, what breathes fire into it all? And then he denied God anyway, even though he almost asked the right question, what makes any of this work? Without God, it doesn't work and would not exist. That's the answer to his damn question, yet he just got finished denying God. In the book, I read the book. So anyway, the cosmological argument says, because we know the universe did not pop into existence from nothing, because that's a logical impossibility, and truth cannot contradict truth, because we know the universe did not pop into existence from absolutely nothing for no reason, then the universe had to have been created by a pre-existing reality. And we can actually know by logic some of the conditions of that pre-existing reality simply by virtue of the fact that anything exists, which goes further than the ontological argument. That's why the two arguments are often used in tandem, because one can do some things that the other cannot. So we know that the pre-existing reality has to be self-eternal, or it wouldn't have existed either. So it has to be self-eternal. It has to be uncaused because it must be the first thing that ever came into existence, and it's self-eternal, so it didn't actually come into existence. It always existed. Those are two things that you can reason out by logic that the first cause of reality must contain. Must be and must contain. And then there's a third condition that you can also reason out. Because there's nothing else outside of the first cause at the time the first cause existed before it did anything else. The only way it could have done anything other than just exist forever is if it was, in fact, entirely self motivated, because there was nothing outside of itself to change it into doing something else. So it has to be self motivated, which means that it has to be a free moral agent. And the only way that could be is if it was, in fact, an eternal mind that always existed. So the three conditions that the cosmological argument can, in fact, define, even about reality before this universe existed, proves that there was, in fact, an absolutely almighty eternal mind, which we call God. And that is the true God. Which the ontological argument started by saying that the true God is the greatest conceivable being, that there is no conceivable way that anything could be greater than the true God. And the cosmological argument is able to reason out at least three eternal attributes of this almighty true creator God, who absolutely is the greatest conceivable being. And it bears that out because he is, in fact, past eternal and uncaused. And the fourth attribute is that he is so powerful that he created the entire multiverse and everything that could possibly ever exist outside himself. So he is almighty. How could you possibly define almighty other than the first cause created everything that ever existed, past, present, or future? So he is almighty. The first cause is, by definition of the argument. So this numbskull claiming that he could undermine the ontological argument by inserting the word super before God and then putting the phrase super God in place of the appearance of God every time in the ontological argument, I was like, no, you can't, because we already stated in line 1 that there is no conceivable being that could be greater than the true God. There's no way that a false God could be greater than the true God by virtue of the fact that the false God doesn't exist at all, while the true God, in fact, does exist. So the claim that you made a super God by simply sticking the word super before the word God is a lie. I tried to explain that to that numbskull. I spent like a day and a half trying to explain that to him. And he would not admit that the phrase super God does not at all undermine any of the arguments in the ontological argument, much less the cosmological argument. So that is the ontological argument and the cosmological argument. It absolutely proves that there is only one true God, and that he is, in fact, the first cause. He is, in fact, self-eternal, uncaused, and moreover, he is, in fact, a free moral agent, a mind being, and last but certainly not least, he is, in fact, almighty by any rational definition of the word almighty, because he created everything that could ever exist, past, present, and future, outside of himself. So he is almighty. And if there's any greater way to define almighty, I don't yet know it, but if I discover it, I'll make a video explaining that. But I don't know how to rationally define almighty any greater than creating all of reality outside of himself. Because I think that already encompasses everything, even if I don't know how to specifically define individual acts. But that is the only way I actually know how to rationally define the terms of almightiness. All right, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much.